The fire crackled in the stone hearth, sending shadows dancing across the log walls of the small cabin. Outside, snow fell soft and steady, the way it does in Montana when winter's making promises it intends to keep. Martha O'Brien, Mattie to everyone who'd known her these past 68 years, settled deeper into her rocking chair and pulled the quilt across her lap. Her granddaughter Sarah sat cross-legged on the braided rug at her feet, 14 years old, and hungry for stories the way only the young can be. "Grandma," Sarah said, voice hushed like she was asking about something forbidden, "is it true Mrs. Caldwell shot a man once?" Mattie's weathered hand stilled on the quilt. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, the kind of smile that comes from remembering things both terrible and beautiful at the same time. "Shot him?" She let the question hang in the warm air between them. "Child, she did more than that. She saved that whole family." Sarah leaned forward, eyes wide. "Tell me." "Well now." Mattie reached for her coffee cup, took a slow sip, gathering her thoughts the way you gather kindling before building a fire. "Let me tell you how it really started. Not with gunfire, but with a blizzard, and a woman who had nothing but $3 silver and a will strong as iron." She set down the cup and looked past Sarah, past the cabin walls, past the falling snow outside. Looked all the way back to December of 1886, when the world was harder and colder and people had to make choices that would break your heart just thinking about them. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, 25 years old, and every door in Montana Territory was closing in her face. The wind came howling across the plains that Tuesday afternoon, carrying the smell of snow and the promise of something worse. Eleanor Hayes stood in Miller's General Store, her back straight as a fence post, listening to men decide her fate like she wasn't even there. Budget's been cut again. Old Mr. Peterson from the school board wouldn't meet her eyes, just stared at the counter like the grain in the wood held answers. Territory can't afford to keep a teacher through the winter months. 5 other men nodded their agreement. Some looked uncomfortable. Most just looked tired. These were frontier men, used to hard choices and harder seasons. A school teacher's salary was a luxury when cattle were dying and the railroad kept promising to come, but never quite arriving. "I understand." Eleanor's voice came out steady, though her hands were clenched so tight in her patched gloves that her nails bit into her palms. "When would you need me to vacate the schoolhouse?" "Already got a family moving in come Sunday." Mr. Peterson finally looked at her, and there might have been something like regret in his roomy eyes. "Room above the bakery's yours through the week. After that—" He didn't finish, didn't need to. Eleanor nodded once, sharp and quick, and walked out of Miller's store with her head high. Pride was about all she had left to carry, so she carried it well. The bell above the door jangled behind her, cheerful and ignorant of the weight pressing down on her chest. Outside, Bitter Creek spread itself along the rutted main street like a promise someone forgot to keep. The town had maybe 300 souls on a good day, scattered between the saloon, the church, Miller's store, and a dozen other buildings that leaned into the wind like old men too tired to stand up straight. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were noticed before they even stepped off the stagecoach. Eleanor had been here 3 years, long enough to know every face, every story, not long enough to matter when money got tight. She walked past the bakery where she'd been renting a room. Mrs. Kowalski was kneading dough in the window, thick arms working the bread like she was trying to punish it. She didn't look up when Eleanor passed. Probably already knew what the school board had decided. Probably already had a paying tenant lined up. The wind picked up, cutting through Eleanor's thin wool coat like it wasn't even there. She pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking, not sure where her feet were taking her, just needing to move. 3 years ago, she'd stepped off the stage from Ohio with her teaching certificate, her mother's cameo brooch, and a head full of plans. Going to civilize the frontier, she'd thought. Going to bring learning and culture to children who needed it. Going to make something of herself. The frontier had other ideas. First had been the letters from home. Her father's farm sold for debts. Her mother dying of pneumonia that winter, alone because Eleanor was too far away to help. Then Harold Wickham's letter, brief and cold as a January morning. A penniless woman is no suitable wife for a man of my standing. I'm sure you understand. She'd understood all right. Understood that love meant different things to different people. Understood that some folks measured worth in dollars and acres, not in faithfulness or shared dreams. Now this, the final door closing. Eleanor found herself at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The grass was winter brown and brittle, bending under the wind that came racing down from the mountains. Those mountains stood purple and white against the gray sky, beautiful and distant, and completely unconcerned with the troubles of one displaced schoolteacher. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her coin purse, opened it with fingers already going numb from the cold. Inside, 3 silver dollars and a handful of copper pennies. $3. That was everything she had in this world, not enough for stage fare east, even if she had somewhere back east to go. Not enough for a train ticket when the railroad finally came through. Not enough for a month's rent anywhere. Barely enough for a week's food if she was careful. The wind gusted harder, and Eleanor tasted snow in the air. Real snow, the kind that buried fences and closed roads and trapped people in their homes for weeks. The kind that killed you if you weren't prepared. She closed the purse and put it back in her pocket. The 3 coins clinked together, a small sound that felt like a door slamming shut. Behind her, Bitter Creek huddled against the coming storm. Ahead, the prairie stretched endless and empty. And above it all, the sky was darkening with the weight of winter bearing down. Eleanor took a breath that hurt going in, sharp and cold in her lungs. Then she turned and started walking, not back to town, not toward the mountains, but north, along the wagon road that led to the big ranches scattered across the territory. She didn't have a plan exactly, just a memory of iron gates she'd seen on her way into town 3 years ago. Gates that led to a ranch house bigger than anything else for 50 miles. A place where a man named Thomas Caldwell raised cattle and 2 young boys, alone since his wife died. The ladies at church talked about it sometimes, voices dropping to whispers like they were discussing something scandalous. Not proper for a man to tend house and raise babies both. Those poor children growing up without a mother's gentle hand. Someone ought to do something, but nobody ever did. Nobody offered to help beyond the occasional casserole, delivered with sympathetic looks and quick retreats. Eleanor walked faster as the first snowflakes began to fall. She didn't know what she was hoping to find at those iron gates. Charity, maybe. Work as a housekeeper, if she was lucky. Anything that might get her through the winter. Anything that didn't involve freezing to death under a tree, which seemed like the only other option presenting itself. The snow fell harder. Within minutes it was coming down thick and fast, the kind of storm that turned the world white and made you forget there was ever any other color. The wind drove the flakes sideways, stinging Eleanor's face, gathering in the folds of her shawl. She could barely see 10 feet ahead now. But she kept walking, boots crunching through snow that was already starting to stick to the frozen ground. Her feet were going numb, her hands too, even inside her gloves. But she kept walking, because stopping meant giving up, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Then, through the swirling white, she saw them. The gates. Tall iron posts driven deep into the Montana earth with a crossbar overhead that read Caldwell Ranch in letters wrought from the same black iron. The gates stood open, unusual for a ranch this prosperous, but maybe the storm had come up too fast for anyone to think about closing them. Eleanor stopped at those gates, one hand on the cold iron, looking up the long drive that disappeared into the blizzard. Somewhere up there was a house. Warmth. Shelter. Maybe mercy if she was lucky, or maybe just another door closed in her face. She stood there in the falling snow, every instinct she'd been raised with screaming that this was begging, that it was shameful, that a woman of quality didn't show up at a stranger's door asking for handouts. But quality didn't keep you warm at night. Dignity didn't fill your belly. And pride, Eleanor was learning, was a luxury she could no longer afford. She took a breath, let go of the gate, and started up the drive. The snow was falling so thick now that she could taste it on her lips, cold and clean. Her carpet bag, the only possession she had left worth calling her own, bumped against her leg with each step. The house appeared out of the storm like something from a dream. 2 stories of solid timber with glass windows that caught what little light the gray sky offered. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm yellow light spilled from the downstairs windows, looking like salvation itself. Eleanor was still standing there, snow gathering on her shoulders and her resolve wavering, when the front door opened. A man filled the doorframe like he'd been carved from the same timber as his house. Even from 30 feet away, Eleanor could see the surprise register on his face when he spotted her. He stepped out onto the covered porch, not bothering with a coat, despite the cold. Broad shoulders, height that spoke of good feeding and hard work, eyes that probably missed nothing. Thomas Caldwell. Had to be. She'd seen him in town once or twice, always polite when he tipped his hat, but distant as those mountains. The kind of man who existed in a different world from struggling school teachers. "You lost, miss?" His voice carried easily across the yard, deep and steady as bedrock. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn despite the cold. What was she doing here? What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was? Begging? Her voice came out rough, and she had to clear her throat. The storm came up sudden. It was true enough, even if it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was standing in her pocket, weighing about $3. Thomas Caldwell studied her for a long moment, taking in her threadbare coat and the way she clutched that old carpet bag. His eyes were sharp, the kind that missed nothing. Then he stepped down from the porch and walked toward her, his boots making deep prints in the snow. When he got close enough to speak without shouting, he stopped. "You're the school teacher." It wasn't a question. "Was?" Eleanor corrected, lifting her chin despite the way her voice wanted to shake. "The position was eliminated this week." He nodded slowly, like this didn't surprise him much. "Figured as much when I saw you walking up the drive with everything you own in that bag." The observation hit like a physical blow. Was she that obvious? That pathetic? "Storm's getting worse," Thomas continued, glancing up at the sky where snow was now falling in sheets. "Be a blizzard before long?" He looked back at her. "You got somewhere to be?" The simple question was almost her undoing. Somewhere to be, if only it were that easy. "Not particularly," she managed. They stood there in the falling snow, 2 strangers taking each other's measure. Eleanor could see something working behind those winter blue eyes of his, some calculation she couldn't read. When he spoke again, his words came out careful and deliberate. "I've got coffee on the stove, house is warm. Storm like this, a person could freeze to death before making it back to town." It was an offer, but more than that, it was acknowledgement of exactly how desperate her situation was, delivered without pity or judgment, just practical kindness from one person to another. "That's very generous, Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said, "but I couldn't impose—" "You're not imposing." He was already turning back toward the house. "Come on, before we both turn into ice sculptures." Eleanor hesitated for just a moment longer, weighing pride against survival. The snow was falling harder now, already covering her tracks, erasing the path back to town as surely as the school board had erased her future there. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She followed Thomas Caldwell toward the warm light spilling from his windows, her feet crunching through snow that was falling faster now, erasing her tracks almost as soon as she made them. Like the world was saying, "There's no going back now, only forward." The porch was a blessed relief from the wind, and when Thomas opened the front door, the warmth that flowed out felt like salvation itself. Eleanor stepped inside and stopped, caught by what she saw. The entryway alone was bigger than the room she'd been renting at the bakery. Polished wood floors gleamed under lamplight. A staircase curved up to the second floor like something from a picture book. Fine furniture, sturdy and well-made, filled the spaces with the kind of comfort that came from money honestly earned. But it was what she didn't see that caught her attention. No flowers in vases, no embroidered cushions on the chairs, no lace curtains at the windows. The house was clean enough, but stark, functional, like a barn that happened to have nice furniture in it. A house without a woman's touch. "Boys," Thomas called out, hanging his hat on a peg by the door, "come meet our guest." The sound of running feet came from somewhere deeper in the house, and soon 2 small faces peered around the corner of what looked like a sitting room. The older boy, 7 or 8, Eleanor guessed, had his father's strong jaw and serious eyes. He regarded her with open suspicion, like she was a problem that needed solving. The younger one, maybe 5, had softer features and hair that stuck up in all directions. He stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood, unburdened by whatever caution his older brother carried. "This is Miss Hayes," Thomas told them. "She's going to wait out the storm with us." "Are you really a teacher?" the younger boy asked, his eyes wide. "I was," Eleanor replied, crouching down to his level. It felt important to meet him eye to eye. "Do you like learning things?" "Papa says I have to learn my letters, but they're hard." "They are hard at first," Eleanor agreed, "but once you know them, they open up whole worlds." The boy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. The older one remained where he was, watching her like she might steal something if he looked away. "Coffee's this way," Thomas said, gesturing toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "Boys, you get back to your supper." The kitchen was easily the largest Eleanor had ever seen. A cook stove that could have heated half the schoolhouse. Cabinets that stretched clear to the ceiling. A table big enough to seat 10 people, though only 3 chairs looked like they ever got used. But like the rest of the house, it felt empty somehow. Functional, but not lived in. Thomas poured coffee from a pot that had seen better days. The liquid came out dark as midnight and strong enough to wake the dead. Eleanor wrapped her cold fingers around the tin cup and breathed in the warmth. "Storm's getting worse," Thomas observed, nodding toward the window where snow was now falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured everything beyond the porch. "Roads'll be impassable by morning." Eleanor stared into her coffee cup, trying to think of something to say that wouldn't sound like the plea it was. She couldn't ask to stay the night. It wouldn't be proper. And besides, she had nothing to offer in return. "I heard about the school," Thomas said after a moment. "Shame. Children need learning. Not enough to pay for it, apparently. Territories strapped for cash, railroads taking its time getting here, and without easy transport for cattle, tax revenues are down." He took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim. "What'll you do now?" The question she'd been dreading. Eleanor set down her cup with hands that trembled slightly. "I'm not sure. Look for another position somewhere, I suppose." "Where?" Such a simple word. But it laid bare the impossible truth of her situation. There were no other teaching positions, not within 100 miles, not for a woman alone with no family connections and no money for travel. "I don't know," she admitted. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor could hear the wind howling around the house, rattling the windows in their frames. Somewhere in the distance, she heard one of the boys laugh at something, the sound bright and warm, a sharp contrast to the storm outside. "I've got a proposition for you," Thomas said finally. Eleanor looked up, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "I need a wife." The words hung in the warm kitchen air like smoke from the stove. Eleanor was certain she'd misheard. Had to have misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "Not for romance or any of that foolishness," Thomas continued, his voice steady as if he were discussing the price of cattle. "But for practical reasons. Someone to keep house, help with the boys, make sure there's hot food on the table and clean clothes in the drawer. Winter's coming hard, and I can't manage it all alone." Eleanor stared at him. This couldn't be happening. Men didn't just propose marriage to women they barely knew, especially not men like Thomas Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, I hardly know you." "What's to know?" He leaned against the counter, completely at ease with this insane conversation. "I'm a decent man who pays his debts and keeps his word. I don't drink to excess or raise my hand to women or children. I own this land free and clear, and I've got money in the bank you'd want for nothing." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. Her mind raced, trying to catch up with what he was suggesting. "The boys need a mother," Thomas continued. "They're good children, but they're running wild without a woman's influence, and He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I need a partner, someone I can count on." Outside, the wind shrieked like something alive and angry. Eleanor thought of the $3 in her pocket, thought of the long winter ahead, thought of the very real possibility that she might not survive it without help. "It wouldn't be a real marriage," Thomas added quickly, as if reading her thoughts. "Separate rooms, separate lives in many ways. Just two people helping each other through." Eleanor looked around the kitchen at the empty spaces where a woman's touch should have been. Then she thought of the boys in the next room, growing up without softness or gentle guidance. And she thought of herself, standing at those iron gates with snow falling on her shoulders and nowhere else to go. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Thomas considered this, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're educated. The boys could use that. You're alone, which means you'd be committed to making this work. And," he paused, then met her eyes directly, "you're desperate enough to say yes." The brutal honesty of it took her breath away. No pretty words or false promises, just the truth, laid out plain as a winter morning. "I need time to think," Eleanor said. Thomas nodded toward the window, where the snow was now so thick they could barely see the barn. "Storm's not going anywhere, neither are you tonight. We can talk more in the morning." He was right, of course. The decision had been made for her by wind and weather and circumstance. She was here for the night, whether she liked it or not. The question was what she'd choose come morning. Thomas showed her to a small room on the first floor that had probably been meant for a housekeeper. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Better than anything she could afford on her own. Better than freezing under a tree, waiting for spring that would never come. As Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed listening to the storm rage outside, she tried to imagine what her life would be like in this house. Waking up every morning to cook breakfast for a man who barely knew her name. Washing clothes and tending children who might never accept her as their mother. Living as a stranger in a home that would never truly be hers. But then she thought of the alternative. The cold. The hunger. The very real possibility that winter would kill her before spring came again. Sometimes survival was the only choice that mattered. Outside, the storm howled on. Eleanor pulled the quilts up to her chin and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept turning over Thomas Caldwell's proposition, examining it from every angle like a merchant checking a piece of goods for flaws. A business arrangement, he'd called it. Not romance, not love, just mutual necessity dressed up in wedding vows. She thought about Harold Wickham, who'd promised her love and a future, then abandoned her the moment she lost her money. Thought about the school board, who'd valued her work right up until it became inconvenient. Thought about every closed door and broken promise that had led her to this moment. Maybe, Eleanor thought, honesty was worth more than pretty words. Maybe a man who told you the brutal truth was more trustworthy than one who whispered sweet lies. The wind rattled the windows. Snow hissed against the glass. And Eleanor Hayes, 25 years old with nothing to her name but $3 and a worn carpetbag, lay in a stranger's house and contemplated a choice that would change everything. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the decision that would determine whether she survived this winter or became just another sad story the town ladies whispered about at church. Outside, the blizzard buried the world in white. Inside, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and waited for dawn to tell her what kind of woman she was going to be. Morning came gray and silent, with the peculiar stillness that only follows a real storm. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting under her door, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the events of yesterday came flooding back, and with them the weight of the decision that lay ahead. She dressed quickly in her one good dress, a navy wool that had seen better days but was still respectable, and pinned her dark hair back as neatly as she could manage. In the small mirror above the washstand, a woman looked back at her. 25 years old, but her eyes seemed older. The frontier did that to people. Aged them in ways that had nothing to do with years. When she emerged from the small room, she found Thomas standing at the kitchen window, looking out at a world transformed by snow. The storm had dumped what looked like 2 feet, maybe more. Drifts rose halfway up the fence posts, and the road, if it could still be called that, was nothing but an unbroken expanse of white stretching toward town. "Storm's blown itself out," he said, without turning around. "Dumped near 2 feet by the look of it." Eleanor joined him at the window and caught her breath. The entire landscape had been erased and rewritten in white, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Isolating. "You weren't exaggerating about the roads being impassable," she murmured. "Takes a few days to dig out after a storm like that, sometimes longer." Thomas finally turned to face her, and she could see the question in his eyes, the one he was too polite to ask outright. "Coffee's fresh," he said instead. "Boys are still sleeping." Eleanor accepted the tin cup he offered, grateful for something to do with her hands. The coffee was strong and hot, cutting through the chill that seemed to have settled in her bones. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, then stopped. "How did one discuss a marriage proposal that wasn't really a marriage proposal?" "About the arrangement?" Thomas leaned against the counter, his expression giving nothing away. "I need to understand what you're really asking. You say the boys need a mother, but what does that mean exactly? What would you expect from me?" Thomas considered his words the way she was learning he always did. Nothing careless or casual about this man. The boys need consistency. Someone to make sure they eat proper meals and keep clean. Someone to teach them manners and help with their letters. They're good children, but they've been without a woman's guidance for 2 years now. "And what about you? What would you expect from a wife?" The word felt strange on her tongue, speaking of something that had once seemed so far out of reach. Someone to manage the household, make sure there's food prepared and clothes mended. Someone I can depend on when I'm out working the cattle or handling business in town. He paused, studying her face. "Someone who won't run off at the first sign of hardship." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "And in return, security, a roof over your head and food on your plate. Protection. My name, if that matters to you." Thomas's voice was matter-of-fact, as if they were negotiating the price of grain. "You'd be mistress of this house. The boys would be yours to raise as you see fit." It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. No talk of affection or companionship, certainly no mention of love. Eleanor found herself oddly relieved by his directness, even as part of her felt hollow at the clinical nature of it all. "Separate rooms," she said, more to clarify than to question. "Separate rooms," Thomas confirmed. "You'd have your privacy, and I'd have mine." "Unless," he trailed off, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. "Unless what?" "Unless someday we decided different. But that'd be a long way off, if ever. And it would be your choice as much as mine." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away. The practical nature of the arrangement was one thing, but the possibility of something more, sometime in the distant future, that was territory she wasn't prepared to explore. Not yet. The sound of small feet on the stairs interrupted the moment, followed by a voice calling for his father. Thomas moved toward the hallway, but the boy appeared in the kitchen doorway before he could get there. The younger one, Samuel, she remembered, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Papa, is the lady still here?" "Miss Hayes is still here," Thomas confirmed. "Say good morning." Samuel ducked his head shyly. "Good morning, Miss Hayes." "Good morning, Samuel. Did you sleep well?" The boy nodded, then seemed to remember something important. "Did you see all the snow? It's up to the windows." "I did see it. Quite a lot, isn't it? Papa says we might be snowed in for days and days." He looked at Eleanor with something like hope in his eyes. "Will you stay that long?" The innocent question hung in the air. Eleanor felt Thomas watching her, waiting for her answer. She looked down at Samuel's hopeful face, then past him to where Daniel had appeared in the doorway, still wary but listening intently. In Ohio, there had been a farm. Not a big one, but enough to keep a family fed and clothed. Her father had worked that land for 30 years. On seamsters, planting and harvesting, building a life from dirt and sweat. Eleanor could still remember the smell of turned earth in spring, her mother's garden full of vegetables and flowers that served no purpose except beauty. Then the debts had come. Bad weather, bad luck, bad timing. The farm sold to strangers, her parents scattered. Her mother hadn't lasted one winter away from the land she'd loved. Eleanor had promised herself then that she'd never be that vulnerable again, that she'd make her own way, depend on her own skills, need nothing from anyone. But the frontier had taught her something her pride hadn't wanted to learn. Sometimes survival meant accepting help. Sometimes strength meant knowing when to bend. "I might," Eleanor said carefully, answering Samuel's question while looking at Thomas. "If your father doesn't mind the company." Mattie O'Brien paused in her telling, reaching for her coffee cup. Sarah sat transfixed at her feet, firelight dancing across her young face. "Did she say yes right then?" Sarah asked. "Did she agree to marry him?" Mattie smiled. "Patience, child. Some decisions can't be rushed, even when storms trap you and choices narrow down to nothing." She took a sip of coffee, remembering. She'd been in that kitchen the next morning, arriving early to start breakfast like she'd done every day for 15 years. Had walked in to find Thomas and Eleanor sitting at the table, both of them looking like they'd been wrestling with something bigger than themselves. "The truth is," Mattie continued, "Eleanor Hayes was scared. Not of Thomas, he was a good man, and she could see that clear enough. She was scared of becoming nothing, of trading one kind of poverty for another, of disappearing into someone else's life and forgetting she'd ever had her own." Outside Mattie's cabin, the snow fell soft and steady. Inside, the past came alive in an old woman's voice. But she was also practical, and she knew that winter was coming, and winter out here doesn't care about your pride or your dreams. Winter only cares whether you're strong enough to survive it. Eleanor spent the rest of that morning with the boys while Thomas went out to check on the livestock. Samuel chattered nonstop, showing her his toys and asking endless questions about letters and numbers and whether she knew any songs. Daniel kept his distance, watching from across the room with those serious eyes that seemed to be weighing and measuring everything she did. "Can you really teach us to read?" Samuel asked, holding up a wooden horse that looked well-loved, its paint worn smooth by small hands. "I can," Eleanor said. "Would you like me to?" "Yes." "Daniel says letters are stupid, but I think they're like secret codes." "They are very much like secret codes," Eleanor agreed, smiling despite herself. "Once you learn them, you can decode any book in the world." She glanced at Daniel, who was trying to look uninterested, but failing. "What do you think, Daniel? Would you like to learn some secret codes?" The older boy shrugged, but she caught a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Maybe." It was the first word he'd spoken directly to her. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. When Thomas returned an hour later, stamping snow off his boots, he found Eleanor sitting on the floor with both boys. Samuel was tracing letters in the dust by the fireplace, while Eleanor guided his hand. Daniel sat nearby, pretending to play with his toys, but clearly listening to every word. Thomas stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching this domestic scene with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Something like relief, maybe? Or longing. It was hard to tell. "Miss Hayes," he said finally, "might I have a word?" Eleanor stood, brushing dust from her skirt. She followed Thomas to his study, a room she hadn't seen yet, lined with books and papers and the accumulated business of running a ranch. He closed the door and turned to face her. "You've been thinking on my proposal." It wasn't a question. "I have," Eleanor admitted. "And?" She took a breath, gathering her courage. This was it. the moment where she chose her path, for better or worse. "If I agreed," she said slowly, "when would you want to, that is, how soon would you expect?" "Soon as the preacher can get here," Thomas said. "Roads should be clear enough in a few days." So fast. Her entire life changed in the space of a week. It seemed impossible. Yet here she was, seriously considering it. "Mr. Caldwell, Thomas, I need you to understand something." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm accepting this arrangement because I need it, because winter's coming, and I have nowhere else to go, but I won't pretend it's something it's not. This is a business transaction, and I'll fulfill my end of it. I'll care for your home and your children. I'll be a good wife in all the practical ways, but don't expect me to be grateful every moment. Don't expect me to forget that this is necessity, not choice." A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's face. "I wouldn't want you to forget. A woman who knows her own mind is worth 10 who just nod and agree." "Then yes," Eleanor said, "I'll marry you." Thomas extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor shook it. His grip was firm and warm, calloused from years of hard work. It felt like sealing a bargain, which she supposed it was. "Welcome to the family, Miss Hayes," he said. From somewhere in the house came the sound of the boys arguing over something, followed by a crash that suggested they'd knock something over. Thomas winced. "I should warn you, they're not always as well behaved as they've been this morning." Eleanor smiled, her first real smile since arriving at the ranch. "Mr. Caldwell, I've spent 3 years teaching school. I'm not easily shocked by misbehaving children." 3 days after the roads cleared, Reverend Morrison arrived at the Caldwell Ranch looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in Montana territory. The elderly preacher sat stiffly in the front parlor, his Bible clutched in weathered hands, casting disapproving glances between Thomas and Eleanor as if they were wayward children who'd tracked mud through his church. "This is highly irregular," he said, for the 3rd time, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Marriage is a sacred institution, not a business transaction." Mattie O'Brien stood in the corner of the room there as witness and whatever help might be needed. She'd arrived that morning, had taken one look at the whole situation, and declared it sensible enough, much to the Reverend's dismay. Eleanor smoothed her hands over her best dress, the same navy wool she'd worn the morning after the storm, now freshly pressed and adorned with a simple white collar she'd fashioned from an old petticoat. It wasn't much of a wedding dress, but it would have to do. "With respect, Reverend," Thomas said, his voice patient but firm, "the marriage will be legal and binding. The reasons behind it are our own concern." The preacher's lips pursed like he'd tasted something sour. "And the children? What example does this set for young Daniel and Samuel?" "It sets the example that sometimes practical decisions serve everyone better than romantic foolishness," Thomas replied. Eleanor caught a movement in the doorway and saw both boys peering around the corner. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but Samuel was practically bouncing with excitement. "Can we start now?" Samuel called out, apparently tired of waiting. "Boys, go to the kitchen," Thomas instructed. "Miss Murphy will give you some bread and jam." Mattie smiled at that. "Come on, you two. Let the grown folks do their business." Once the boys had reluctantly departed, Reverend Morrison opened his Bible with visible reluctance. "Very well, but I want it understood that I'm performing this ceremony because you've asked it of me, not because I approve of the circumstances." "Understood," Thomas said. The ceremony itself was mercifully brief. Eleanor found herself repeating words that felt strange and foreign on her tongue, promising to honor and cherish a man she'd known for less than a week. Thomas's responses were delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss cattle prices, though his eyes never left her face. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, there was an awkward moment when it became clear he expected Thomas to kiss his new bride. Thomas looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. She gave an almost imperceptible nod, and he leaned down to press his lips briefly against hers, a chaste, formal kiss that sealed their bargain without promising anything more. "Well," Mattie said brightly as the Reverend packed away his Bible, "that's done then. Mrs. Caldwell, welcome to the family." Mrs. Caldwell. Eleanor felt a strange jolt at hearing her new name. She was no longer Eleanor Hayes, the displaced schoolteacher. She was Eleanor Caldwell, wife and mother, mistress of one of the largest ranches in 3 counties. The boys burst back into the room before anyone could say more, Samuel launching himself at Eleanor with such enthusiasm that she nearly lost her balance. "Are you really our mama now?" he asked, his small arms wrapping around her waist. "I suppose I am," Eleanor said, smoothing his unruly hair. Daniel hung back, watching this display with the same wariness he'd shown since her arrival. Eleanor met his eyes over Samuel's head and saw the challenge there. "Prove yourself worthy," his expression seemed to say. After Reverend Morrison and Mattie departed, Mattie with a knowing look and a promise to return tomorrow to help Eleanor settle in, the new family found themselves alone together for the first time. The house felt different somehow, as if the brief ceremony had shifted something fundamental in its foundation. "I'll show you to your room," Thomas said, and Eleanor realized that while she'd been staying in the small housekeeper's quarters, her status as wife, even a wife in name only, required different accommodations. He led her upstairs to a bedroom at the end of the hall, opening the door to reveal a space that was clearly feminine in its furnishings. A delicate writing desk sat beneath the window, and the bed was adorned with a quilt worked in shades of blue and yellow. Lace curtains framed the window. A vanity stood against one wall, its mirror reflecting back the room's careful beauty. It was lovely, but there was something heartbreakingly still about it, as if it had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. "This was," Eleanor began, then stopped. "My wife's room. Margaret's room." Thomas's voice was carefully neutral. "I thought you might prefer it to the one downstairs. More privacy up here." Eleanor stepped inside, running her fingers along the edge of the writing desk. She could almost feel the presence of the woman who had once sat here, perhaps writing letters or tending to household accounts. It felt like trespassing. "I don't want to disturb anything," she said quietly. "The room needs to be lived in," Thomas replied. "Margaret's been gone 2 years. Time it served its purpose again." He left her alone to settle in, and Eleanor spent several minutes simply standing in the center of the room, trying to absorb the reality of her situation. This was her space now, her sanctuary in a house full of strangers who were now her family. She unpacked her few belongings from the carpet bag, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe beside gowns that had belonged to another woman. Margaret Caldwell had clearly favored fine fabrics and elegant cuts, silk dresses and wool coats that spoke of comfort and prosperity. Eleanor's simple cotton and wool garments looked shabby by comparison, like orphans taken in out of charity. On the vanity, she found a hairbrush with a few strands of auburn hair still caught in its bristles. A bottle of lavender water, half empty. A cameo brooch pinned to a velvet cushion. Eleanor picked up the brush, studying those auburn strands. This was Margaret. Not a ghost or a memory, but a real woman who had lived in this room, brushed her hair at this vanity, looked at herself in this mirror. A woman who had been everything good and gentle, if Thomas's grief was any measure. A woman who had been loved deeply and mourned completely. A woman Eleanor could never replace. She set down the brush carefully, as if it might break, and turned to look out the window. From here she could see the barn and the corral, where several horses grazed. Beyond that the land stretched away toward distant mountains, vast and unforgiving. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, but it also emphasized how isolated they were out here, how dependent on each other for survival. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Samuel's head appeared around the doorframe. "Papa says supper's ready. He made beans and bacon." Eleanor smiled. "That sounds wonderful. I'll be right down." She followed the boy downstairs to find the kitchen transformed from the stark functional space she remembered. Someone, Mattie she assumed, had set the table with proper dishes and had even found a small vase for some late-blooming wildflowers. It was a small touch, but it made the room feel more welcoming. Thomas was at the stove, dishing up their simple meal with movements that spoke of long practice. He'd shed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, and Eleanor was struck by how domestic he looked, nothing like the imposing figure she'd first encountered. "Smells good," she said, taking a seat at the table. Daniel was already seated, picking at his food with little enthusiasm. Samuel chatted happily about everything and nothing, clearly delighted by the novelty of having a woman at their table again. "Mrs. Murphy said you might teach us our letters properly now," Samuel announced between bites of beans. "She said real teachers know all sorts of things." "I do know quite a few things," Eleanor agreed. "Would you like to start tomorrow?" "Can we?" Samuel turned to his father with pleading eyes. Thomas nodded. If your new mama thinks you're ready." The word caught in his throat slightly, and Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy. This arrangement was as strange for him as it was for her. Perhaps stranger. At least she was only taking on a new role. He was watching his children attach themselves to a replacement for someone irreplaceable. "I think we could start with simple words," Eleanor said. "Things you see every day. Horse, barn, sky." "What about my name?" Samuel asked eagerly. "Especially your name." Daniel finally looked up from his plate. "I already know some letters," he said quietly. "Do you?" Eleanor leaned forward with genuine interest. "That's wonderful. Perhaps you can help me teach Samuel." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Surprise, maybe, that she would acknowledge his knowledge rather than dismissing it. It was a small crack in his defensive wall, but Eleanor filed it away as progress. After supper, while Thomas tended to evening chores in the barn, Eleanor found herself alone with the boys in the sitting room. She'd brought down one of her few books, a collection of simple stories, and was reading aloud when she became aware of how intently both children were listening. "You read different than Papa," Samuel observed when she paused. "Different how?" More like the words have feelings." Eleanor smiled. "Words do have feelings in a way. The trick is learning to hear them." "Read more," Daniel said, and it was the first time he'd made a direct request of her. She continued reading until Thomas returned, stamping snow off his boots and hanging his coat by the door. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room for a moment, watching this domestic scene, and Eleanor wondered what he was thinking. Was he comparing her to Margaret? Finding her wanting? "Time for bed, boys," he said finally. There was the usual chorus of protests and negotiations, but eventually both children were herded upstairs to wash and change into their nightclothes. Eleanor helped Samuel with his buttons and listened to his prayers, a sweet, rambling conversation with God that covered everything from his new mama to his favorite horse to a request for no more blizzards. Daniel was more reserved, accepting her help, but offering little conversation. When she tucked the blankets around him, however, he looked up at her with something like curiosity. "Are you really going to stay?" he asked quietly. "I really am," Eleanor promised. "Even when it gets hard? Papa says winters here are terrible hard." Eleanor thought of all the hard things she'd already survived, the loss of her family, the dissolution of her engagement, the months of uncertainty and want. "I think I can manage hard," she said. Something in her tone must have convinced him because Daniel nodded and settled back against his pillow. "Good," he said simply. When Eleanor came back downstairs, she found Thomas in the kitchen, cleaning up the supper dishes. She picked up a dish towel and began drying without being asked. They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes before Thomas spoke. "They like you." "Samuel does." Daniel's still deciding. "Daniel's been the man of the house too long. He's forgotten how to be a child." Eleanor dried a plate thoughtfully. "Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Children who've had to grow up fast often turn into strong adults." "Maybe, but I'd like him to have some childhood left, if possible." It was the most personal thing Thomas had shared with her, this wish for his son's happiness. Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Not romantic feeling exactly, but something like partnership, like they might actually be able to do this together. "I'll do my best to help with that," she said. Thomas nodded, hanging up the dish rag. "I'll be up early tomorrow. Cattle need checking, and there's fence to mend before the next storm hits." "What time should I have breakfast ready?" "5:30, if that's not too early." Eleanor had been rising at 5:30 for years as a schoolteacher. "That's fine." "Boys usually eat around 7. Samuel likes his eggs soft, Daniel likes his firm. Both of them will eat anything sweet you put in front of them, but don't let them fill up on it or they'll be sick." These domestic details felt both ordinary and momentous. She was learning the rhythms of her new family, the small preferences and habits that would shape her days. "I'll remember," she said. Thomas seemed to realize he was giving her instructions like she was a hired hand rather than his wife, because he paused and looked at her directly. "Eleanor, Mrs. Caldwell, this is your house now, too. You don't need permission to change things or do what you think best." It was a generous gesture, and Eleanor appreciated it more than she could say. "Thank you. That means a great deal." They stood there in the kitchen for a moment, two people who were now bound together by law and circumstance, trying to figure out how to navigate this strange new territory. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "I should let you get settled. Tomorrow will be a long day." "Good night, Mr. Caldwell." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "We're married now, after all." "Good night, Thomas." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her new room, Margaret's room, and prepared for bed. As she brushed her hair in front of the vanity mirror, she caught a glimpse of her reflection and was surprised by what she saw. The woman looking back at her didn't look defeated or desperate. She looked determined, ready for whatever came next. She set down the brush, carefully, not wanting to disturb the auburn strands still caught in its bristles, and climbed into bed. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender, and Eleanor wondered if that scent had been Margaret's preference, or if it was just the soap used for washing. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the windows and reminding her how quickly the weather could change out here. But inside, the house felt solid and warm, safe. She'd made her choice and spoken her vows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning the rhythm of ranch life, winning over a wary little boy, figuring out how to be a wife without truly being a wife. But tonight, for the first time in months, Eleanor Caldwell fell asleep in a bed that belonged to her in a house where she had a right to be. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a girl, but it was a life. And maybe, just maybe, it could be a good one. The first week of Eleanor's marriage passed in a blur of small discoveries and careful navigation. She learned that Thomas took his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. That Samuel was afraid of thunderstorms but not blizzards. That Daniel had taught himself to read simple words by studying the labels on canned goods in the pantry. She learned that the kitchen stove had a temperamental damper that required coaxing, and that the upstairs floorboards creaked in a specific pattern that could wake the boys if she wasn't careful walking to her room at night. What she didn't learn was anything meaningful about the woman whose place she had taken. Margaret Caldwell remained a carefully guarded mystery. Her clothes still hung in the wardrobe. Her hairbrush still sat on the dressing table with those few strands of auburn hair. Her presence was everywhere and nowhere, felt in every empty space and unspoken word. But no one spoke of her. It was as if the family had collectively agreed that mentioning the dead would somehow make Eleanor's presence less legitimate. The silence around Margaret became more pronounced on the 8th day of Eleanor's marriage, when she discovered Daniel sitting on the floor of what had once been a nursery, clutching a small wooden horse and staring at a portrait that had been turned to face the wall. Eleanor hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to intrude on what was clearly a private moment. The room was thick with dust and abandonment. Baby furniture covered with sheets like ghosts of a life that might have been. "She made this for me," Daniel said quietly, not turning around. He held up the wooden horse, its paint worn smooth by small hands. "Before Samuel was born, she said every boy needed a good horse to ride." Eleanor stepped carefully into the room. "It's beautiful workmanship. She could make all sorts of things, toys and quilts and—" His voice caught. She was making a cradle for the baby, the one that didn't come. The weight of that simple statement settled over Eleanor like a shroud. Another baby, another loss that no one had mentioned. She died having Samuel, Daniel continued, still staring at the overturned portrait. But there was supposed to be a baby sister, too. They both died. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She'd known that childbirth had claimed Margaret Caldwell, but she hadn't known about the other child. The twin loss explained so much: Thomas's carefully controlled grief, the way the boys seemed to carry an extra weight of sadness, the absolute silence around their mother's memory. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, settling on the floor beside Daniel. "That must have been very frightening for you." "Papa cried," Daniel whispered, as if confessing a terrible secret. "I wasn't supposed to see, but I did. He held Mama and cried like the world was ending." Eleanor thought of Thomas as she'd come to know him: steady, practical, emotionally reserved, and tried to imagine him broken by grief. The image was almost too painful to contemplate. "Sometimes even the strongest people need to cry," she said gently. Daniel finally turned the portrait around, revealing a woman with kind eyes and auburn hair, holding baby Samuel while a younger Daniel stood proudly beside her chair. Margaret Caldwell had been beautiful in a wholesome, practical way, with laugh lines around her eyes and work-worn hands folded gently in her lap. "She looks like someone who gave very good hugs," Eleanor observed. "She did." Daniel's voice was wistful. "She smelled like bread and lavender, and she always had time to listen." They sat in silence for a moment, two people mourning a woman one had known and one had not. "Do you think she's watching us from heaven?" Daniel asked quietly. "I mean, do you think she minds that you're here now?" The question hit Eleanor like a physical blow. It was the fear she hadn't even admitted to herself, that she was somehow betraying the memory of a woman she'd never met, that her presence was an insult to the love Thomas had lost. "I'm not trying to replace your mother," Eleanor said firmly. "No one could do that, and I wouldn't want to. But maybe there's room for both of us in your heart. Your mother for the love you'll always carry, and me for whatever new kind of caring we might build together." Daniel studied her face with those serious eyes that seemed too old for a boy of 7. "You promise you won't leave, even if it gets hard?" "I promise." The boy seemed to weigh her answer, then carefully placed the wooden horse on a shelf where it could watch over the room. "Samuel doesn't remember her much. He was too little. But I tell him stories sometimes so he won't forget." "That's a good thing to do," Eleanor said. Would you maybe tell me some of those stories sometime? I'd like to know about her." For the first time since Eleanor had known him, Daniel smiled without reservation. "I'd like that." They left the nursery together, but Eleanor carried the weight of what she'd learned. That evening, after the boys were in bed, she found Thomas in his study, working on account books by lamplight. "May I come in?" He looked up, surprise flickering across his features. Eleanor rarely disturbed him in the evenings, respecting the unspoken boundaries of their arrangement. "Of course." She settled in the chair across from his desk, trying to find the right words. "Daniel showed me the nursery today. He told me about the baby sister who didn't survive." Thomas's pen stilled on the page. When he looked up, his eyes were carefully blank. He shouldn't have been in that room. "I've told the boys to stay out of there." "He misses her," Eleanor said gently. "He misses them both, his mother and the sister he never got to meet. The past is the past." Thomas's voice was clipped. "No good comes from dwelling on what can't be changed." But Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the pen too tightly. Forgetting isn't the same as healing. "I'm not trying to forget." Thomas set down the pen and leaned back in his chair. "But I can't live in yesterday, Eleanor. I have today to manage and tomorrow to prepare for. That's all any of us can do." Eleanor understood the sentiment, but she also heard the pain underneath it. The boys need to talk about her sometimes. They need to know it's safe to remember. "And what would you have me tell them?" Thomas's voice rose slightly. "That their mother was perfect and wonderful, and that nothing I can provide will ever measure up. That every day I wake up knowing I failed to protect the most important people in my life." The raw honesty of his words caught Eleanor off guard. She'd never heard such emotion in Thomas's voice. Never seen him drop his carefully maintained composure. "You couldn't have prevented what happened," she said quietly. "Couldn't I?" Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I should have insisted she go to Denver for the birth, where there were proper doctors. Instead, I listened when she said she wanted the babies born at home. I let sentiment override sense, and it cost her everything." Eleanor felt her heart break a little for this man who carried such crushing guilt. "Thomas, you can't know that a different choice would have changed anything, and even if it might have, torturing yourself won't bring her back." "No," he agreed, still staring out at the darkness. "It won't, but it reminds me not to make the same mistakes again." The conversation hung heavy between them, full of grief and regret and carefully guarded vulnerability. Eleanor wanted to reach out, to offer some gesture of comfort, but she sensed that Thomas wouldn't welcome the contact. "The boys need to know they can talk about her," she said instead. "Not constantly, not in a way that keeps the wound fresh, but sometimes when the memories come." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "She used to sing to them, Irish lullabies her grandmother taught her. Samuel's too young to remember, but Daniel sometimes hums the melodies when he thinks no one's listening. That's beautiful. She wanted to teach them to play piano. We were going to buy one when the railroad finally came through, make shipping easier." Thomas's smile was sad and brief. "She had all sorts of plans for when the boys got older. Wanted to start a lending library, maybe organize a quilting circle for the women in the area." Eleanor felt a pang of something that might have been envy. Margaret Caldwell had been more than just Thomas's wife. She'd been his partner in dreams for the future, his companion in building a life that went beyond mere survival. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Eleanor said. She was. Thomas met her eyes directly. "She was everything good and gentle in this world. And I need you to understand, what we have, what we've arranged between us, it's not the same thing. It can't be." The words stung, but Eleanor appreciated his honesty. "I understand." "Do you?" Thomas stepped closer. "Because I don't want you to have expectations that can't be met. I don't want you to hope for something that died 2 years ago." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not hoping for anything beyond what we agreed upon. I know what this arrangement is." But even as she said it, she realized it wasn't entirely true. Over the past week, as she'd watched Thomas with his sons, as she'd seen glimpses of kindness and humor beneath his practical exterior, she had begun to hope. Not for grand romance, but for friendship, for partnership, for the possibility that two people thrown together by circumstance might eventually choose to stay together for better reasons. Now, faced with the full weight of Thomas's love for his dead wife, those small hopes felt foolish and presumptuous. "I should let you get back to your work," she said, rising from the chair. "Eleanor." The use of her name made her pause. "I'm grateful for what you're doing. For the boys, for the household. I don't want you to think I'm not. I know. And if you need anything, if there's something you want changed or improved, you only have to ask." It was a generous offer, but Eleanor could hear the distance in it. She was the hired help who happened to wear a wedding ring, useful and appreciated, but not truly part of the family's heart. "Thank you," she said simply. She climbed the stairs to Margaret's room, to the space that was supposed to be hers, but still felt like borrowed territory. Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another storm. Inside, Eleanor sat at the writing desk and stared at her reflection in the darkened window. She had known this wouldn't be easy, had accepted Thomas's proposal with full knowledge that she was entering a marriage without love, a family where she would always be the replacement rather than the first choice. But hearing him speak of Margaret with such reverence, seeing the depth of his continued devotion, made the reality harder to bear than she'd expected. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Daniel peeked around the doorframe, dressed in his nightgown, bare feet on the cold floor. "I couldn't sleep." "Bad dreams?" "No, just thinking too much." He came into the room and settled on the small chair by the window. "I heard you and Papa talking downstairs." Eleanor felt a stab of concern. "What did you hear?" "Enough." Daniel's expression was serious beyond his years. I heard you and Papa talking about Mama, about how she died. Daniel, it's okay, he interrupted. I know Papa blames himself. I heard him tell Mr. Murphy that once when he thought I was asleep. But it wasn't his fault. The boy's loyalty to his father was touching. Sometimes people blame themselves for things they couldn't control, Eleanor said carefully. It's a way of trying to make sense of senseless things. Do you blame yourself for things? The question caught Eleanor off guard with its directness. Sometimes. Like what? Eleanor considered how much honesty was appropriate for a 7-year-old. I used to blame myself for my family losing our farm back in Ohio. I thought if I'd been smarter or worked harder, maybe I could have helped save it. But you were just a girl then. I was. But feelings don't always make sense. Daniel nodded solemnly. I used to think that if I'd been better, if I hadn't fought with Samuel so much or tracked mud in the house, maybe Mama wouldn't have died. Eleanor's heart clenched. Oh, Daniel, your mother's death had nothing to do with anything you did or didn't do. I know that now, mostly. He looked out the window at the darkening sky. But sometimes the bad thoughts come back anyway. Eleanor wanted to gather this serious little boy into her arms, to promise him that the bad thoughts would go away if she just held him tight enough. Instead, she said, that's normal. Grief is like weather. Sometimes it's sunny and sometimes storms blow through. The important thing is to remember that storms always pass. Is that why you married Papa? Because of our storm? The boy's perception was startling. Partly, Eleanor admitted. We all needed shelter from different kinds of storms. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you think you'll ever love us? Really love us, not just take care of us? The question pierced straight through Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. Oh, Daniel, she said softly, I already do. The words surprised her with their truth. Somewhere in the past week, between helping with buttons and reading bedtime stories and listening to small confidences, she had indeed begun to love these children, not as a replacement for their mother, but as themselves. 2 brave little boys trying to make sense of a world that had taken too much from them too young. Really? Daniel's eyes were bright with hope. Even though we're not really your children? Love doesn't work that way, Eleanor said gently. Love isn't about sharing blood or even sharing a name. It's about caring for someone's happiness and wanting to be part of their story. Daniel considered this with the gravity he brought to all important matters. Finally, he nodded. I'm glad you're here, Eleanor. Even if Papa doesn't love you the way he loved Mama, I'm still glad. It was, Eleanor realized, exactly what she needed to hear. Not a promise of the love she couldn't have, but an acknowledgement of the love she could earn. The love she was already earning, one small moment at a time. I'm glad I'm here too, she said. Now, let's get you back to bed before your father finds us conspiring in here. As she tucked Daniel into his bed for the second time that night, Eleanor felt something settle into place inside her chest. She might never have Thomas's heart. That belonged to a ghost she could never compete with. But she could have his respect, his partnership, and the love of his children. For now, that would have to be enough. But as she returned to Margaret's room and climbed into bed, listening to the wind howl around the house, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder. How long could she live in the shadow of a perfect dead woman? How long before she needed more than just being needed? Outside, the storm gathered strength. Inside, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and knew that her greatest challenges lay not in surviving Montana's harsh winters, but in surviving the slow erosion of living as a placeholder in someone else's life. Tomorrow, she would face the town. Tomorrow, the judgment would begin in earnest. But tonight, she allowed herself one small tear for the girl she'd been, the one who'd dreamed of a love match, of being chosen first instead of settled for. That girl was gone now, buried under snow and necessity. What remained was Eleanor Caldwell, wife and mother by contract, learning to build a life from the raw materials of survival. It would have to be enough. It had to be. The first test came on a Sunday morning, 2 weeks after the wedding. Thomas announced at breakfast that they would attend church services in town, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist with nerves. She'd been sheltered at the ranch, learning the rhythms of the household, winning small victories with the boys, but she knew the real judgment was waiting for her in Bitter Creek. She chose her navy dress again, still her finest garment, and pinned her hair back severely, trying to look as respectable as possible. In the mirror, she saw a woman who looked older than her 25 years, marked by recent hardships, but determined to hold her head high. The ride to town was quiet. Daniel sat beside his father on the driver's bench while Eleanor rode in the back with Samuel, who chattered excitedly about seeing his friends at church. She wished she could share his enthusiasm. Bitter Creek's church was a simple wooden building with a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the prairie. As their wagon approached, Eleanor could see other families arriving, their breath forming clouds in the cold air as they greeted each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd known each other for years. The conversation stopped when the Caldwell wagon pulled up. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze as Thomas helped her down. She could hear the whispers starting before her feet even touched the ground, sharp sibilant sounds that carried on the winter air like the hiss of snakes. Quick work, wasn't it? Poor Margaret, not cold in her grave. School teacher thinks she's landed herself quite a prize. Eleanor lifted her chin and took Samuel's hand, following Thomas toward the church doors. The crowd parted before them like water, conversations resuming in hushed, urgent tones as they passed. Inside the church, the scrutiny was even more intense. Eleanor could feel eyes following their every movement as they made their way to the Caldwell family pew, the same pew where Margaret had once sat, holding her babies and singing hymns in a voice that people still remembered fondly. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, leaned over to whisper something to Mrs. Patterson, who had been a fixture at the church for 30 years. Both women glanced pointedly at Eleanor, their expressions ranging from disapproval to barely concealed hostility. Eleanor sat straight-backed between Thomas and Samuel, trying to focus on Reverend Morrison's sermon about charity and Christian kindness. The irony was not lost on her that the same man who had reluctantly performed their marriage ceremony was now preaching about loving thy neighbor. After the service, the real trial began. The congregation gathered outside for their weekly social hour, and Eleanor found herself the center of attention she'd never wanted. Women clustered in small groups, voices low but eyes sharp, watching her every move. Mrs. Caldwell, Mrs. Henderson approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How are you finding married life? Quite different from teaching school, I imagine." "Different, yes," Eleanor replied carefully, "but rewarding." "I'm sure it must be. Such a lovely home, and of course the security that comes with marrying so well." The emphasis on security made it clear what Mrs. Henderson thought of Eleanor's motivations. Other women gathered around, drawn by the promise of gossip. Eleanor recognized most of them from her teaching days, when they had been polite, if not particularly warm. Now their manner was distinctly chilly. "It must be difficult," Mrs. Patterson said with false sympathy, stepping into dear Margaret's shoes. She was so beloved by everyone who knew her. "Margaret was certainly special," Eleanor agreed, refusing to take the bait. "Oh, she was more than special," Mrs. Jenkins chimed in. "She was practically a saint, the way she cared for everyone in the community, always bringing soup to the sick and helping with birthing. Why, when my youngest was born, Margaret sat with me for 3 days straight, barely sleeping." The other women nodded and murmured agreement, their voices taking on the reverent tone usually reserved for discussing actual saints. Eleanor realized what was happening. They were testing her, seeing how she would react to being compared to the paragon she could never hope to equal. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Eleanor said quietly. "The boys speak of her with such love." "Do they?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "And how are the poor dears adjusting to having a stranger suddenly thrust into their mother's place?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, a small voice piped up from behind her. "She's not a stranger," Samuel announced, slipping his hand into Eleanor's. "She's our new mama, and she teaches us letters, and knows how to tie sailor knots." The women looked surprised by the boy's forthright defense. Eleanor squeezed his hand gratefully. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said stiffly, "children do adapt quickly to new circumstances." "They do indeed," said a new voice. Eleanor turned to see Mattie O'Brien approaching with a determined expression. "And speaking of adaptation, Eleanor here has done wonders with those boys. You should see how well behaved they are now, and how much young Samuel has learned in just a few weeks." Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude for the older woman's support, but Mrs. Henderson was not deterred. "Oh, I'm sure Mrs. Caldwell is adequate in her domestic duties. It's just that some of us remember when this family was the heart of our community. Margaret organized the church socials, led the ladies' auxiliary, coordinated help for families in need. Such big shoes to fill." The challenge was unmistakable. Eleanor was being told, in front of half the congregation, that she was expected not just to be Thomas's wife and the boy's mother, but to take on all of Margaret's community roles as well, roles for which she had no training and even less confidence. "I'm sure Eleanor will find her own way to contribute," Mattie said firmly. "Every person brings different gifts to a community." "Of course," Mrs. Henderson agreed with a smile sharp as winter wind, "though we do hope those gifts will be substantial. The Caldwell family has always been so generous with their time and resources." Eleanor felt trapped between competing expectations. If she tried to fill Margaret's role, she would inevitably fall short and be criticized for it. If she didn't try, she would be condemned for being selfish and inadequate. Either way, she couldn't win. Before she could formulate a response, a commotion near the church steps drew everyone's attention. Daniel had apparently gotten into some kind of altercation with Billy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's son, and the two boys were facing off with fists raised. Thomas strode over quickly, taking Daniel by the shoulder. "What's going on here?" "He said my new mama was just a gold digger," Daniel burst out, tears of anger streaming down his face. "He said she only married you for money and doesn't really care about us." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as every conversation in the churchyard stopped. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, while Thomas looked from his son to Billy Henderson to the ring of adults watching the drama unfold. "Billy," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness, "I think you owe my wife an apology." "I was just repeating what I heard," Billy mumbled, glancing nervously at his mother. "Then perhaps," Thomas continued, his gaze moving deliberately to Mrs. Henderson, "you need to be more careful about what you listen to." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red. "Mr. Caldwell, I hardly think it's appropriate to blame a child for—" "I'm not blaming the child," Thomas cut her off. "I'm suggesting that adults should consider their words more carefully when little ears are listening." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and Eleanor saw several people look away uncomfortably. She realized that Thomas was defending not just her honor, but the family they had built together, fragile though it might be. Samuel, apparently inspired by his older brother's courage, stepped forward. "My mama does too care about us," he announced to the assembled crowd. "She makes our breakfast every morning and reads us stories, and she fixed my torn shirt without even being asked, and she promised she won't leave us, even when things get hard." The simple, heartfelt declaration from a 5-year-old carried more weight than all the adult posturing. Eleanor saw several faces soften, and Mattie wiped what might have been a tear from her eye. Daniel, emboldened by his little brother, stepped up beside Samuel, "And she's teaching us to read properly. And she knows all about numbers and history. And she makes Papa smile sometimes, real smiles, not just polite ones." This last observation seemed to surprise Thomas himself, who looked down at his older son with something like wonder. The tension began to dissipate. People started returning to their normal conversations, though Eleanor noticed several women making a point of speaking to her with genuine warmth for the first time. As they walked back to the wagon, Thomas fell into step beside her. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "Some people have too much time and too little sense." "It's all right," Eleanor replied. though her hands were still shaking slightly from the confrontation. "I expected there would be talk. That doesn't make it acceptable." They rode home in thoughtful silence, broken only by Samuel's occasional chatter. Eleanor noticed that Daniel kept glancing at her with something like pride, and she realized that their relationship had shifted subtly during the morning's events. By defending her, he had claimed her as truly part of the family. The trouble started 3 days later. Thomas came back from checking the herd with his face like granite. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing the midday meal when she heard his boots on the porch, heavier than usual, angry. "Something wrong?" she asked when he entered. 20 head missing from the north pasture." Thomas hung his hat with more force than necessary. "Fence was cut. Clean cuts, not broken. Someone drove them off." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. "Rustlers? Looks that way." Thomas poured himself coffee, his movements tight with controlled fury. "I'm calling a meeting with the hands. Need to figure out how to protect what's ours." That evening, Eleanor listened from the hallway as Thomas gathered his ranch hands in the front parlor. Jake Morrison was there, along with Miguel Santos, who handled the horses, and young Peter Walsh, who was barely 18. "It's not just us," Miguel reported, his quiet voice carrying clearly. "Talked to Henderson's foreman in town yesterday. They've lost cattle, too, and the Johnson place up north. They're missing near 50 head. "Anyone see anything suspicious?" Thomas asked. "Stranger's been asking questions in town," Jake offered. "Well-dressed fellow, claiming to be a cattle buyer. But he was asking mighty specific questions about who owned what land and how many men each ranch employed." Eleanor felt her blood chill. This wasn't random theft. It was reconnaissance. "There's something else," Miguel said quietly. "That fellow, he was asking about the railroad survey too. Wanted to know which route they'd finally decided on." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "The railroad," he said finally. "Someone wants our land for the railroad." The pieces began falling into place for Eleanor, listening in the hallway. The cattle theft wasn't just about the animals. It was about weakening the ranch financially, making it harder for Thomas to hold on to his property. Someone was trying to force him to sell. "What do?" young Peter asked. "We watch, we wait, and we protect what's ours," Thomas replied grimly. After the men left, Eleanor found Thomas standing at his study window, staring out at the darkness. "You think someone's trying to drive you off your land?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I know they are." Thomas didn't turn around. "The railroad's coming through eventually. Whoever owns the land along the route stands to make a fortune, or lose everything, depending on which side of the deal they're on. What will you do?" "Fight." The word was simple, absolute. "This land is mine. My father broke his back clearing it, building it. Margaret and I planned our future on it. I'll be damned if I let some railroad speculator steal it out from under me." Eleanor heard the determination in his voice, but also something else. Fear, maybe. The knowledge that some fights couldn't be won by will alone. "How can I help?" she asked. Thomas finally turned to look at her, surprise clear on his face. "You?" "This is my home too now," Eleanor said simply. "And if someone's threatening it, I want to help defend it." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. "Can you shoot?" "My father taught me when I was 12. "Then I'll teach you to handle a rifle properly. Tomorrow." The next 2 weeks brought more bad news. 15 more head vanished from the eastern pasture. Then a dead bull was found, killed rather than driven off, a message that this was about more than just theft. Thomas taught Eleanor to shoot, his hand steady on hers as he showed her how to aim the rifle, how to compensate for wind, how to reload quickly. Those moments, standing close in the cold air, with gunpowder smoke drifting between them, were some of the most intimate they'd shared. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Caldwell," Thomas said after she hit her 3rd target in a row. "So are you, Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor replied, and for the first time she saw him smile, really smile, the way Daniel had mentioned, not a polite social smile, but something genuine and warm. Then came the day Jake Morrison stumbled back to the ranch with blood soaking his shirt. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the shouting. She ran outside to find Miguel helping Jake toward the house, the foreman's face white with pain. "What happened?" Eleanor demanded, already moving toward them. "Found him by the creek," Miguel panted. "Shot in the shoulder." They got Jake into the kitchen, and Eleanor immediately began assessing the wound with the calm competence her mother had taught her. The bullet had passed clean through the meaty part of his shoulder. Painful, but not life-threatening if kept clean. "I need hot water, clean cloth, and whiskey," she instructed Miguel, "and send someone to get Thomas." As she worked to clean Jake's wound, he told his story through gritted teeth. "Was checking the fence line like Mr. Caldwell asked. 3 men, maybe 4, cutting wire and driving cattle toward the old mining road. When they saw me, one of them just up and shot me. Didn't even warn me off first." Eleanor's hands stilled for a moment. These weren't ordinary thieves trying to avoid capture. They were sending a deliberate message. Anyone who interfered would be hurt. "Did you recognize any of them?" she asked. "One looked familiar, thought I'd seen him in town but can't place where, and there was a name mentioned." Jake winced as Eleanor tied off the bandage. "Harrison, or maybe Blackwood, one of those." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she didn't know why the name should affect her. Thomas arrived as she was finishing, his face white when he saw the blood. "How bad?" "Clean wound," Eleanor reported. "He'll need rest and careful tending, but he should heal fine." Thomas's eyes met hers across the table, and she saw something new in his expression, a recognition of her competence under pressure that went beyond managing household tasks. That night, after Jake had been settled in the bunkhouse and the boys put to bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about that name, Harrison Blackwood. It tickled at the edges of her memory, familiar somehow. On impulse, she went to Margaret's writing desk and began going through the drawers. She felt like an intruder, but something was nagging at her. In the bottom drawer, she found a bundle of old letters tied with ribbon, yellowed with age. She untied the ribbon with trembling fingers and opened the first letter. The handwriting was flowery, masculine, the paper expensive. "My dearest Margaret, I write to you again, though you have not answered my previous letters. I cannot accept that you would choose that rough frontier farmer over a man who can offer you everything, culture, comfort, a life of refinement in Denver." It was signed with an elaborate flourish, Harrison Blackwood. Eleanor's heart began to race. She opened another letter, then another, all from Blackwood, all pleading with Margaret to reconsider her choice, to leave Thomas Caldwell and come to him in Denver. The last letter was dated 15 years ago, shortly before Margaret's marriage. "I will never forgive Thomas Caldwell for stealing you from me, never." Eleanor sat back, her mind racing. Harrison Blackwood, the well-dressed stranger asking questions in town, the man coordinating the cattle thefts. He wasn't just some railroad speculator trying to acquire land. He was a man with a 15-year-old grudge. She found Thomas in his study, showed him the letters, watched his face go hard as stone as he read them. "Blackwood," he said quietly. "I thought he'd let it go. It's been 15 years. Some men nurse grudges like children," Eleanor said. "Thomas, if he's doing this because Margaret chose you, if this is personal, then he won't stop." Thomas looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real fear in his eyes. "He'll keep coming until he destroys everything I have. The ranch, the cattle, the—" He stopped. But Eleanor heard what he didn't say. "The family, you and the boys." "Then we fight," Eleanor said firmly. "We protect what's ours." Thomas stared at her. "You understand what that might mean? This could get dangerous. You could walk away, Eleanor. This isn't your fight." Eleanor thought of the boys sleeping upstairs, of the life she'd begun to build here, of the fact that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being just necessity and started being something more. "It became my fight when I said my vows," she said, "when I promised those boys I wouldn't leave. She stopped herself, surprised by what she'd been about to say. "When I started caring about you." Thomas stood, crossed to her, stopped just short of touching her. Eleanor, whatever he'd been about to say was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats outside. Fast, urgent. They ran to the window to see Miguel galloping toward the house, his face frantic in the moonlight. "Fire!" he shouted. "Fire in the north pasture! They're burning the range!" Thomas grabbed his coat and rifle. Eleanor did the same, ignoring his protest. "I told you," she said firmly. "This is my fight, too." As they ran out into the cold night, toward the orange glow on the horizon, Eleanor realized that everything was about to change. Harrison Blackwood had made his move. Now they would have to make theirs. And somewhere in the darkness, a man who'd loved a dead woman was coming to destroy the living. Mattie paused in her telling, the fire burning low in her cabin. Sarah sat transfixed, eyes wide. "Did they save the ranch?" the girl whispered. Mattie smiled, but there was sadness in it. "That night?" "Yes. They fought the fire until dawn, saved most of the pasture, but fires can be put out, child. Grudges burn longer." "What happened next?" "Next," Mattie said quietly, came the night when Eleanor Hayes Caldwell discovered just how strong she really was. The night she picked up a gun and proved she wasn't just a school teacher playing at being a rancher's wife. She set down her coffee cup, eyes distant with memory. "But that's a story for tomorrow. Tonight, you need your rest. Grandma. Tomorrow, Sarah. Some stories are too important to rush." Outside, the snow fell steadily, covering the world in white. Inside, the fire burned down to embers. And in the silence, the ghosts of the past waited to speak again. The attack came 2 nights later. Eleanor woke to gunfire and men shouting. For a moment she lay frozen, hoping it was a dream. Then she heard Thomas's voice bellowing orders in the yard, and reality crashed over her like cold water. She threw on her robe and ran to the boys' room. Daniel was already awake, sitting up in bed with wide, frightened eyes. Samuel was still asleep somehow, undisturbed by the chaos outside. "What's happening?" Daniel whispered. "Bad men are trying to steal our cattle," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Your papa and the ranch hands are fighting them off. I need you to be very brave and help me with Samuel." Daniel nodded solemnly, already reaching for his clothes. Eleanor gently woke Samuel, who began to cry when he heard the gunshots. "It's all right, sweetheart," she soothed, lifting him into her arms. "We're going to play a game of hiding, just like we practiced." She led them quickly downstairs to the kitchen. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the pantry floor. Eleanor had prepared it over the past few days with blankets, water, and food, hoping she'd never need to use it. She lifted the door and saw Daniel's face pale at the dark opening below. "I don't want to go down there," Samuel whimpered. "I know, baby, but it's safe, and Papa will come get us when the bad men are gone." Eleanor was about to follow the boys down when she heard a crash from the front of the house. Someone was trying to break in. Her blood turned to ice. If the rustlers got into the house, they'd find the boys easily enough. The root cellar was good for hiding from casual searchers, but not from men who had time to look thoroughly. "Daniel," she whispered urgently, "take Samuel and hide in the very back corner. Cover yourselves with the blankets and don't make a sound no matter what you hear. I'll be back soon." "Where are you going?" Daniel's voice was tight with fear. "To make sure the bad men don't find you." Eleanor closed the trap door and quickly rearranged the pantry to hide it. Then she grabbed Thomas's shotgun from beside the kitchen door, a weapon she'd learned to load and fire during her lessons with him. The front door splintered just as she reached the hallway. 2 men burst into the house, both armed, moving with the confidence of people who thought they faced no real opposition. They froze when they saw Eleanor standing at the end of the hall, shotgun raised and pointed directly at them. "This is private property," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You need to leave now." One of the men laughed. "Well, look what we have here. Thomas Caldwell's new bride, trying to play soldier." "Last warning," Eleanor said, tightening her grip on the weapon. The men exchanged glances. She saw the calculation in their eyes. They thought she was bluffing, that a schoolteacher turned rancher's wife wouldn't actually pull the trigger. They were wrong. When the first man took a step toward her, Eleanor fired. The blast echoed through the house like thunder. The man went down with a cry, clutching his leg. His companion raised his pistol, but Eleanor was already reloading with movements her father had drilled into her until they were instinctive. "Next one goes in your chest," she warned. The second man hesitated, looking between his wounded companion and the determined woman with the shotgun. In that moment of hesitation, Thomas appeared in the doorway behind them, his own weapon drawn. "Smart choice would be to drop your gun," Thomas advised quietly. The fight went out of the intruders quickly after that. The wounded man was groaning and bleeding, but not critically injured, and his companion seemed more interested in surrender than heroics. As Thomas tied them up, Eleanor finally allowed herself to shake. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving her knees weak and her hands trembling. "Eleanor," Thomas's voice was soft, wondering, "are you all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Thomas stepped closer, gently taking the shotgun from her hands. "The boys?" "Safe in the root cellar." Thomas's expression was a mixture of pride, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "You could have hidden with them." "They're my children too," Eleanor said simply. And in that moment, something fundamental changed between them. Thomas looked at her not as the practical solution to his domestic problems, but as his partner, his equal, his wife in every sense that mattered. "Yes," he said quietly, "they are." The marshal arrived 2 days later with his deputies to collect the captured men and investigate the rustling operation. Marshal Brady was a weathered man in his 50s who listened to their account with patient attention. "Railroad speculation," he confirmed when Thomas finished explaining. "We've been tracking a group operating across 3 territories. They identify valuable land, then use intimidation and theft to force owners to sell cheap." Eleanor served coffee in the front parlor, noting how Thomas unconsciously positioned himself close to her chair. Not possessively, but protectively. "What can be done about it?" Thomas asked. "We've got enough evidence to arrest the men you're holding," Marshal Brady said, "and they're talking, hoping for reduced sentences. Seems there's a main organizer working out of Denver. Fellow named Harrison Blackwood." Eleanor saw Thomas tense beside her. "Figured you might know that name," the marshal continued. "He's been making inquiries about your property specifically. Seems to think your land is crucial for the railroad route he wants to build." "And if I don't want to sell?" Thomas asked. "Then they'll keep trying to make you want to," Marshal Brady said grimly. "This kind of operation doesn't give up easy." The marshal and his deputy stayed for 2 days, taking statements and gathering evidence. On the morning they prepared to leave, Marshal Brady pulled Thomas aside. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "We found correspondence in one of the prisoner's belongings, letters between Blackwood and a man here in Bitter Creek. Someone's been feeding him information, your schedule, when your hands are away, details about your finances." "Who?" Thomas demanded. Marshal Brady glanced toward town. "Henderson, the banker." Eleanor felt the world tilt. Mr. Henderson, respectable, church-going Mr. Henderson, had been betraying them all along. No wonder Mrs. Henderson had been so hostile. No wonder the town had turned against Eleanor so quickly. "He'll be arrested when we get back to town," the marshal assured them, "along with Blackwood, if we can find him." After the lawman left, Thomas was quiet for a long time. Eleanor found him in the barn that evening, brushing down his horse with mechanical movements. "Thomas?" "Henderson's known me since I was a boy," he said without turning around. "He held the mortgage on this land when my father died, helped me keep it when I didn't have the money, and all along he was planning to take it anyway." "Some people's greed runs deeper than loyalty," Eleanor said softly. Thomas set down the brush and finally looked at her. "You were right. About grudges burning longer than fires. Blackwood's been waiting 15 years for revenge against a woman who's been dead for 2. Margaret chose you," Eleanor said. "She chose this life, this land, these children. That was her choice, not his, to contest." "And you?" Thomas stepped closer. "What did you choose, Eleanor?" Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. "I chose survival at first. I won't lie about that. I came here desperate and took what you offered because I had no other option. And now? Now, Eleanor took a breath. Now I stay because I want to. Because I love those boys upstairs. Because this ranch feels like home. Because you— She stopped, not quite brave enough to finish. Because I what? Thomas prompted gently. Because when you smile, really smile, not just politely, I feel something I didn't expect to feel again. When you taught me to shoot, standing behind me with your hands on mine, I didn't want you to let go. When I heard gunfire that night and thought you might be hurt, I was terrified. Not because I'd lose security or shelter, but because I'd lose you. Thomas closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Eleanor, I need to tell you something about Margaret. Eleanor braced herself, expecting him to say he could never love again, that his heart was buried with his first wife. I loved her, Thomas said. She was gentle and good, and losing her nearly destroyed me. But loving her doesn't mean I can't love you. It just means my heart is big enough for both. He took both her hands in his. You're not Margaret. You never tried to be. You're fierce where she was gentle, practical where she was romantic. You faced danger with a shotgun instead of prayers. He smiled. And I love you for exactly who you are. Not because I need you, though I do, but because I choose you. Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes. I choose you too, she whispered. Every day I choose you. Thomas kissed her then, not the formal peck of their wedding day, but with the warmth of a man who had found something precious he'd thought lost forever. Eleanor melted into the kiss, her hands finding their way to his shoulders, feeling the solid reality of him under her palms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I want to do this properly, he said, the way we should have done it the first time. Will you marry me again, Eleanor Caldwell? Not for necessity, but for love? Eleanor laughed through her tears. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. The second wedding happened on a Sunday morning in early spring, when the snow was finally melting and the first green shoots were pushing through the earth. Thomas had planned it in secret with Mattie's help, and Eleanor knew nothing until wagons began arriving at the ranch, loaded with food and decorations and half the population of Bitter Creek. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony on the front porch, under the old oak tree, where icicles were dripping in the warming sun. This time, his smile was genuine as he pronounced them husband and wife. I believe, he said with a twinkle in his eye, this is how it should have been done the first time. Thomas's vows made Eleanor cry. You brought laughter back to this house and light to corners that had been dark too long. You loved my children when you didn't have to, and defended our home with a courage that humbles me. I promise to cherish you, to stand by you, and to choose you every day for the rest of my life. Eleanor's own vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. You gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go, but more than that, you gave me a family, a purpose, and a love I never dared to hope for. I promise to be your partner in all things, and to help you build a future worthy of the dreams we share. When they kissed, the gathered crowd cheered. Daniel and Samuel whooped with delight, and even Mrs. Henderson, who had apologized tearfully for her husband's betrayal, wiped away tears. The celebration lasted until sunset. There was music and dancing, food and laughter. Jake Morrison, his shoulder nearly healed, raised his glass in a toast. To Mrs. Caldwell, he said warmly, the bravest woman I ever met, and to Thomas, the luckiest man in Montana. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, Eleanor and Thomas stood together on the porch, watching the last wagons disappear down the road. What happens now? Eleanor asked, leaning against him. Now we live, Thomas said simply, together, really together. Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought them here, from her desperate arrival during a blizzard to this evening when everything had changed. It hadn't been the romance of storybooks, but it had been real, built on respect and partnership, tested by adversity, and strengthened by the decision to keep choosing each other. I'd like that, she said. Mattie O'Brien set down her coffee cup and looked at her granddaughter, who sat transfixed by the fire. "And that's the story," she said softly, "the real story of how Eleanor Hayes became Eleanor Caldwell." "Did they live happily ever after?" Sarah asked. Mattie smiled. "Happily, child, they lived truly. They had 3 more children, built the school Eleanor wanted, faced more storms, both weather and otherwise, but they faced them together, and that's better than any fairy tale." "What about Blackwood? Did they catch him?" "Marshal Brady tracked him down in Denver. He stood trial for the rustling and the arson. Last I heard, he's still in territorial prison." Mattie paused. "Some grudges end in jail cells. Better than they deserve, maybe. But there it is. And the ranch? Still standing. Daniel runs it now. He's got his father's steady hands and his mother's sharp mind. Samuel became a teacher like Eleanor. Carries on her love of learning." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Grandma, was it really love? Or was it just making the best of things?" Mattie considered the question seriously. "People ask me that sometimes. Was it love at first sight? I tell them no, it was something better. It was love at last choice." She reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Sarah's ear. "Every day they chose each other. Through hard winters and dry summers, through arguments and making up, through the birth of babies and the burial of dreams replaced by new ones. They chose each other. And that, child, is frontier love. Not perfect, not easy, but real." Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The world lay quiet and white under a sky full of stars. "Real love," Mattie continued, her voice soft with memory, "isn't about being swept away by passion or rescued by a hero. It's about 2 people standing together and saying, 'This, I choose this, I choose you,' every single day." She stood slowly, joints creaking, and moved to the window. In the distance, she could just see the lights of the Caldwell Ranch, still burning bright after all these years. Eleanor used to say that necessity brought them together, but choice kept them together. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. Keep choosing the people we love, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Sarah joined her at the window, looking out at the snow-covered prairie. "Do you think they were happy, really?" "I think they were grateful," Mattie said. "Grateful for second chances and new beginnings. Grateful for the family they built from the raw materials of survival. That's a better kind of happiness than most people ever find." She turned from the window and smiled at her granddaughter. "Now, off to bed with you. Morning comes early, and tomorrow's another day for choosing." As Sarah climbed the stairs to her room, Mattie returned to her chair by the fire. She sat for a long time watching the flames dance and remembering a young woman with nothing but $3 and a will of iron. Remembering 2 children who learned that love could come in unexpected packages. Remembering a man who learned that hearts could heal and love again. And remembering the simple truth that had guided them all. Sometimes the best stories are the ones you never saw coming. The ones that start with desperation and end with devotion. The ones that prove that love, real love, is built one choice at a time. Outside, the Montana wind whispered across the plains, carrying the promise of spring. Inside, the fire burned low, and an old woman smiled, content with the stories she'd carried all these years, stories of courage and survival. Stories of second chances and hard-won joy. Stories of a frontier woman who came to a ranch with nothing and left with everything that mattered. The kind of stories worth passing down. The kind that remind us all we are not defined by where we start, but by what we choose to become. And Eleanor Hayes Caldwell had chosen well. They all had.